A woman stands at an open window with her back turned nearly all the way to the room behind her. She holds a letter in both hands, her eyes fixed on the page, and the light from outside falls across her face and the paper with a clarity that makes the whole scene feel briefly suspended, as if she has forgotten the room exists. Behind her is a wall of plain, unbroken gray, the kind of empty backdrop that later became one of the signatures of the painter who made this picture, Johannes Vermeer, working in the small Dutch city of Delft sometime around 1657. For more than 3 centuries, that wall was read as a deliberate choice, a mark of the restraint Vermeer would carry through the rest of his short career, paring his interiors down until nothing remained but light, a figure, and the single object holding her attention. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What almost nobody outside a small circle of conservators knew for decades was that the wall had not always been empty. Beneath the gray paint, hidden since long before anyone alive today was born, sat another picture entirely, one that Vermeer had put there himself, and that someone else, much later, painted out of existence. The story of how that picture came back into the light does not only change how we look at one canvas, it changes how confidently anyone can claim to understand Vermeer at all. Vermeer left behind one of the smallest bodies of work of any painter now considered essential to the history of art. Fewer than 40 paintings are accepted as his by scholars today, the product of a working life that lasted barely 2 decades before his death in Delft in 1675, when he was only 43. He joined the Delft Painters Guild in his early 20s, inherited an art-dealing business from his father, and appears to have supported his large household as much through buying and selling other artists' work as through the sale of his own. He worked slowly and used expensive materials without restraint, grinding natural ultramarine from imported lapis lazuli even for passages of drapery that a less careful painter would have rendered in a cheaper blue. Delft in those years was a small city with an outsized artistic reputation, home for a time to the young Karel Fabritius, whose own promising career ended in 1654 when a gunpowder magazine exploded in the middle of the city, destroying much of the neighborhood around it and killing him, along with dozens of others. Vermeer was in his early 20s when that happened, working in the same small artistic community, and the disaster remains a small reminder of how much of the record around this period simply did not survive to be studied. That combination of small output and meticulous, unhurried technique is part of why a painter now treated as one of the essential figures of the Dutch Golden Age produced so little that anyone at the time bothered to record. Girl reading a letter at an open window belongs to Vermeer's early period, painted before the tightly controlled interiors that would define his mature reputation, before the milkmaid, before woman holding a balance, before the small tilted head in a turban now known simply as the girl with the pearl earring. In this earlier picture, the domestic world is still slightly less pared back than it would become. A heavy green curtain hangs across part of the left edge of the composition, as though drawn aside for the viewer a moment before the scene began, a device Vermeer would return to in later paintings as a way of making the viewer feel like an intruder on a private moment. A dish of fruit sits on the table in front of the woman, tipped just enough to suggest it was recently disturbed. Vermeer includes one of his characteristic private touches as well, a faint reflection of the woman's face caught in the glass of the open window, visible only if the viewer looks closely enough to notice that the pane is doing more work than simply admitting light. And on the wall behind her, according to what would eventually be uncovered, hung a painted image of Cupid, standing upright, holding a single card aloft in one raised hand. That same Cupid, or one close enough to be unmistakable, appears fully visible and undisputed in 2 other paintings from Vermeer's own hand, one now in the National Gallery in London, titled Lady Standing at a Virginal, the other in the Frick Collection in New York, titled Girl Interrupted at Her Music. In both of those works, the small figure on the wall carries the identical raised card, an emblem scholars have traced to the moralizing picture book tradition popular across the Dutch Republic, most famously codified in Otto van Veen's widely circulated Book of Love Emblems, published in Antwerp in the first decade of the 1600s and still in print, in various editions, well into Vermeer's own lifetime. A Cupid holding up a single card carried a specific meaning for a 17th century viewer trained to read such things. Choose one love and remain faithful to it. Placed on the wall behind a young woman absorbed in a private letter, the symbol carried real commentary, a suggestion about the nature of the letter she held and the feelings it might contain, the kind of visual joke or warning that a Delft household in the 1650s would have caught instantly, and that a modern viewer, standing in front of the same canvas today, has no built-in way of recognizing at all. Lady Standing at a Virginal shows a young woman in an elaborate satin dress standing before her keyboard instrument, a viol resting unplayed on the floor beside her, and the same painted Cupid hanging on the wall just above her head, fully visible, never disguised, never questioned. Girl Interrupted at Her Music shows a woman turning away from her sheet music toward a man leaning close beside her, the identical Cupid watching the exchange from the same position on the wall behind them both. In neither painting has anyone ever suggested the Cupid was added or altered after the fact. They simply hang as Vermeer left them, which is precisely what made the Dresden picture's blank wall so easy to explain away for so long. If two other paintings from the same years, using the same emblem in the same position on the wall, had survived completely untouched, then surely, the reasoning went, only Vermeer himself would have had reason to remove it from a third. The painting eventually crossed into the collection of the Elector of Saxony in the middle of the 1700s, acquired in Paris and catalogued under another painter's name entirely, since Vermeer's own reputation had by then faded almost to nothing outside a small circle of Delft collectors. He would not be rediscovered as a major master until a French critic began tracking down his scattered, misattributed canvases across the museums and private collections of Europe more than a century later, publishing his findings and effectively reconstructing Vermeer's catalogue from scratch, painting by painting, cellar by cellar. By the time Girl Reading a Letter at an Open Window was correctly identified as a genuine Vermeer, the wall behind the woman was already, and had apparently long been, a featureless gray. For most of the 20th century, nobody questioned that gray wall. It fit too neatly into the story art historians had already built around Vermeer, a story in which his career moved in one direction only, from the crowded, symbol-laden interiors of his early work toward the austere, light-filled rooms of his maturity. Then, in 1979, a conservator working on the painting at the Gemäldegalerie in Dresden ran an X-ray across the canvas as a matter of routine technical documentation and found something that did not belong in a plain wall. Beneath the surface, clearly outlined in the radiograph, was the rectangular shape of another composition entirely, a large framed image occupying most of the upper wall, with a small standing figure visible inside it. There was no real mistaking what it was. It was the same Cupid, the same raised card, the same emblem that appeared undisguised in the two other Vermeers hanging in London and New York. Somebody, at some point, had painted over an entire picture within the picture, reducing what had once been a room with two paintings in it, the small canvas hung on the wall and the large canvas of Vermeer's own making, to a single blank surface. The 1979 discovery did not lead to restoration. It led instead to a widely accepted explanation that required no restoration at all. Overpainting of this kind was not unusual in the broader history of collecting, and museums across Europe had by then encountered plenty of cases where a later owner altered a picture to fit changing taste, so the discovery itself did not automatically read as scandalous. What made this case different was the explanation the field settled on almost immediately, the consensus that formed around the finding, and that held for close to 4 decades afterward, was that Vermeer had painted over the Cupid himself, deciding at some point that the symbolic clutter of his early style no longer suited the direction he wanted his work to take. Museum labels, catalogue entries, and academic surveys absorbed this account almost without resistance, because it slotted so cleanly into the narrative already being told about him, an artist maturing in real time, visible in the very fabric of the canvas, trading emblem for atmosphere and symbol for silence. The bare wall read as evidence, physical proof of the exact moment Vermeer became the painter later generations would recognize, rather than as any kind of loss. The trouble with that reading, though nobody pressed hard on it for decades, was that it rested entirely on assumption. No document survived recording Vermeer's intentions. No letter, no inventory entry, no contemporary account explained why the Cupid disappeared. The story was plausible. It was also, as it eventually turned out, wrong. The assumption did more than shape how one painting was described. It shaped how an entire career was dated. Vermeer left almost no dated works, and art historians had long relied on stylistic clues. The presence or absence of a decorative element on a back wall, the treatment of light, the complexity of a composition, to place his surviving pictures into a rough chronological order. A bare wall became something close to a marker of later work, a sign that a painting belonged to the artist's mature period rather than his early one. Girl reading a letter at an open window sat awkwardly inside that framework from the start, since its costume details and compositional handling suggested an early date, even as its wall suggested a later sensibility. The explanation that Vermeer himself had painted out the Cupid resolved the contradiction neatly. It let the painting be early in execution and mature in intention at once, a young artist reaching forward toward the style he would eventually make his own. That resolution was comfortable enough that it survived essentially unchallenged for close to 4 decades, repeated in museum wall text, in academic monographs, in the general audience narrative of Vermeer as a painter whose career moved steadily and legibly from ornament toward restraint, a version of the artist that modern viewers, trained by a century of minimalism in design and architecture, found particularly easy to admire. It cast Vermeer as a kind of forerunner, arriving generations early at an idea about empty space that painting would not fully embrace again until long after his death. Part of why nobody tested that idea more rigorously sooner may simply be that it was such a satisfying one to believe, and Vermeer's small, tightly studied body of work has never made scholars eager to disturb a settled reading without unusually strong cause. Vermeer's catalogue has proven unstable in other ways too, which is part of why this particular case matters, beyond the walls of one Dresden gallery. As recently as 2022, a major American museum revisited a small headlong attributed to Vermeer, and after extensive technical study conducted for a large touring exhibition, concluded that the brushwork did not match his hand closely enough to sustain the attribution, downgrading the picture to his workshop or circle rather than the artist himself. Attributions have moved in the opposite direction too, with paintings once dismissed as copies later reinstated as autograph works once cleaning and analysis revealed underdrawing or pigment choices consistent with his documented practice. With a body of work this small, every single painting carries disproportionate weight, and every new piece of technical evidence has the power to rewrite a meaningful fraction of what is confidently known about him. A record-breaking exhibition in Amsterdam in the early 2020s gathered close to 30 of Vermeer's surviving paintings under one roof for the first time in history, and the scholarship generated around that single event revised details of dating, condition, and attribution across a significant share of his catalogue in the space of a few years. Girl reading a letter at an open window sits at the center of that instability now for a different reason than most. Not because anyone doubts Vermeer painted it, but because for decades nobody understood what he had actually painted underneath what later hands allowed the public to see. Part of what made the minimalist reading of this painting so durable was how well it matched a much broader 20th century enthusiasm for Vermeer as a kind of proto-modern artist, a painter whose calm, geometric interiors seemed to anticipate photography decades before the camera existed, and to anticipate abstraction centuries before painters began stripping their canvases down to color and light alone. Critics writing in the middle of the 20th century were fond of describing his rooms as though they had been composed rather than merely arranged, and a bare wall behind a solitary figure fit that description far better than a wall crowded with a second painting and its moralizing little Cupid. The Dresden discovery, in that sense, did more than correct a factual record. It undid a piece of the modern myth that had been built around Vermeer specifically because it made him feel like one of us, a painter working 3.5 centuries ago who had somehow already arrived at an aesthetic sensibility that would not become fashionable again until long after his death. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Vermeer's catalog carries other, darker mysteries that no amount of technical study has been able to touch. In 1990, thieves broke into the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston and stole 13 works of art in a single night, among them Vermeer's The Concert, a painting of 2 women and a man gathered around a keyboard instrument that has not been seen in public since. It remains, more than 3 decades later, the largest unsolved art theft in modern history, and the empty frame still hangs on the Gardner's wall, exactly where the painting used to be, left there deliberately by the museum as a kind of standing wound. Beside a loss of that scale, the Dresden Cupid can look almost gentle by comparison, a mystery that technology and patience were eventually able to solve, rather than one that has simply swallowed a painting whole. But both stories point to the same underlying fact about Vermeer. With a body of work this small, every single canvas carries an outsized share of what the world knows, or does not know, about the man who painted it. And every gap in that record, whether caused by a thief in a museum basement or a paintbrush applied 2 centuries ago in Dresden, reshapes the whole picture more than a comparable gap would for almost any other artist in the history of Western painting. In 2015, the Gemäldegalerie in Dresden began preparing for a major re-examination of its Dutch 17th century holdings ahead of an anniversary exhibition dedicated to Vermeer and Girl Reading a Letter at an Open Window, as one of the museum's most significant paintings, was placed near the center of that project. Conservators returned to the 1979 radiograph with imaging technology unavailable at the time of the original discovery, and rather than simply confirming what the X-ray had already shown, they began asking a question the earlier study had never actually answered. The X-ray could reveal that a second image existed beneath the gray overpaint. It could not, on its own, say who had put the gray paint there, or when. To answer that question, the team turned to a category of evidence far smaller than an X-ray, the physical structure of the paint itself. Conservators removed a series of microscopic paint samples from the boundary between the original composition and the overpaint, each one no larger than a grain of sand, and examined them under magnification as cross-sections, thin slices that show every layer of a painting stacked like sediment, oldest at the bottom, most recent at the top. In a case where an artist paints over his own work while it is still fresh, or even revisits it a few years later during his own lifetime, the layers tend to sit close together, sometimes touching almost directly, with little separating the original paint from what was added on top of it. What the Dresden cross-sections showed instead was a complete, continuous layer of varnish sitting between the Cupid and the gray paint that hid it, the kind of natural resin coating that painters and later owners applied to protect and finish an already completed work, and that takes a meaningful stretch of time, measured in years rather than weeks, to fully harden and age in the way the samples showed it had. A varnish layer of that character does not belong between two decisions made by the same hand in the same period. It belongs to a painting that was finished, coated, hung, and left alone for a considerable time before anyone touched it again. Vermeer, in other words, had not painted over his own Cupid as a considered late revision to an early work. Someone else had done it, and not soon after the picture was completed, but considerably later, after the painting had already been treated as a finished object worth protecting and preserving exactly as it stood. The implications of that single layer of resin took the investigation somewhere the 1979 discovery never had, away from a tidy story about artistic evolution and toward a much harder question. If Vermeer did not remove the Cupid, then somebody else did, deliberately, at an unknown point in the roughly 2.5 centuries between the painting's completion and its documented arrival in the Saxon royal collection, and that person's reasons, whoever they were, had nothing to do with Vermeer's own creative direction at all. The Dresden team could not put a name to that later hand, and they were careful not to invent one where the physical evidence did not support it. What they could say, with a level of confidence the 1979 discovery had never reached, was that the grey wall generations of viewers had come to associate with Vermeer's artistic maturity was in fact a later substitution, imposed on the painting by someone working long after the painter himself was dead, for reasons that had far more to do with 18th or 19th century taste, an era generally less comfortable with overt moralizing emblems in what had become a fashionable genre scene than with anything happening in Delft in the 1650s. Why anyone would have wanted to remove the Cupid at all is a separate question from whether they did, and here the evidence is necessarily thinner, since no note or letter from the period explains the decision. But art dealers and restorers working in the 18th and 19th centuries were known to alter old paintings for the market, with some regularity, softening or removing details that a contemporary buyer might find heavy-handed, old-fashioned, or simply confusing, without the emblematic literacy a 17th century household would have taken for granted. A small, moralizing Cupid, watching over a woman reading what might be a love letter, could easily have read to a later eye as clutter, rather than meaning, an obstacle to the clean, atmospheric interior that later taste increasingly preferred. Whether the change was made by a dealer preparing the painting for sale, a restorer working under instruction, or an owner acting on personal preference, The effect was the same, an authentic 17th century painting, edited to suit an audience that never knew the original composition existed in the first place. Once that conclusion was established, the museum committed to a full restoration, a project that would take roughly 4 years of careful, incremental work to complete. Removing centuries-old overpaint from a canvas this significant is not a matter of stripping a layer away and hoping for the best underneath. Conservators worked millimeter by millimeter under magnification, testing solvents on the smallest possible areas first, softening the later paint just enough to lift it without disturbing the original surface beneath, and stopping constantly to document what each pass revealed before continuing to the next. Some sections came away relatively cleanly. Others required weeks of patient, repeated work to separate the overpaint from the delicate original brushwork of a picture within the picture that nobody living had ever properly seen. A single square centimeter could take an entire working day. Slowly, the outline that had only ever existed as a shadow on an X-ray began to resolve into an actual, painted image, a standing Cupid rendered with the same confident, economical brushwork found throughout the rest of the canvas, unmistakably the work of the same hand that had painted the woman and the letter and the fall of light across the windowsill. By the time the restoration was complete, in the spring of 2021, the painting the museum unveiled differed from the picture that had hung in Dresden for generations. For the first time in longer than anyone could document, visitors were looking at the picture Vermeer had actually painted, letter, fruit, curtain, and Cupid together, in the room he originally built around his subject. What emerged from beneath the grey paint was a fully realized painting within the painting, not merely a fragment or a ghost of an image, roughly rectangular, hung in a plain dark frame against the wall, the way a real picture would have hung in a real 17th century room. The Cupid inside it stands with one leg forward, bare and pale against a dark background, one arm raised to hold the single card at shoulder height, the same stance and the same proportions found in the London and New York versions. The brushwork is looser and faster than the careful description Vermeer gives the woman and the letter in front of it, exactly the kind of shorthand a painter uses for a picture inside a picture, something meant to be recognized rather than studied. Restorers were even able to recover something of its coloring, muted golds and browns against the darker field behind the figure, close enough to the palette used in the other two Cupids, that nobody who has seen all three side by side doubts they came from the same hand working within the same short stretch of years. The unveiling drew attention well beyond the usual circle of Vermeer specialists, in part because so few genuine surprises are still possible with an artist whose surviving work has been examined this closely for this long. Photographs of the before and after circulated widely, the flat grey rectangle on one side and, on the other, a room that suddenly looked inhabited by something more than a single figure and a table. But the real weight of the discovery sits less in the restored Cupid itself than in what it forces scholars to reconsider about everything built on top of the wrong assumption. For nearly 40 years, the empty wall in this painting was treated as a data point, evidence used to support a particular account of how Vermeer's style developed, and, by extension, evidence used to help date other undocumented paintings against that same developmental arc. If the emptiness here was never Vermeer's choice at all, then every argument that leaned on it has to be revisited, not because the underlying chronology is necessarily wrong, but because one of the pillars propping it up has been removed. That is the mystery this restoration genuinely resolves. It settles, with physical evidence rather than stylistic guesswork, the specific question of whether this particular blank wall reflected the artist's own late intentions. It did not. 2 years later, the restored painting traveled to Amsterdam to take its place in that record-breaking exhibition gathering close to 30 of Vermeer's surviving works, and for the first time, visitors could stand in front of girl reading a letter at an open window, beside lady standing at a virginal, and girl interrupted at her music, and see, without needing anything explained to them, that all three paintings had always belonged to the same visual conversation. The Cupid that had been missing from one of the three for roughly 2 centuries was, for that exhibition, finally back where it belonged, hanging in the same kind of quiet Delft interior it had occupied in the other two all along. But settling that question opens a second one that remains entirely unanswered, and that is arguably the more unsettling of the two. Vermeer's mature paintings are dotted with other plain walls, other quiet backgrounds nobody has ever had reason to X-ray with the same scrutiny applied here, because nobody suspected there was anything to find. Until Dresden's cross-sections proved otherwise, this wall did not look suspicious either. It looked exactly like the calm, deliberate restraint everyone already expected to see. There is no evidence that any other Vermeer has been altered in the same way, and nothing here should be read as proof that one has. But there is, for the first time, a documented case of exactly this kind of substitution happening to exactly this kind of painting, carried out well enough that it survived undetected by connoisseurship alone for the better part of 2 centuries. A single confirmed instance does not indicate a pattern. It does indicate that the possibility can no longer be dismissed on the grounds that surely somebody would have noticed by now, since somebody very nearly did not. What the restored Cupid actually proves about Vermeer as an artist is, if anything, more revealing than the minimalist legend it replaces. The painter was not inventing an ahead-of-its-time vocabulary of empty rooms. He was working, in this canvas at least, inside the same moralizing visual tradition as his contemporaries, placing an emblem on a wall exactly the way dozens of other Dutch genre painters of his generation did, using a shared symbolic language his original audience would have read instantly and that later centuries simply lost the fluency to recognize. The restraint modern viewers have spent a century admiring in this particular picture turns out to belong not to Vermeer, but to whoever painted him out of his own room, someone whose name and motive Dresden's conservators could reconstruct only in outline, a change carried out sometime after the varnish had settled and never once recorded in any surviving document connected to the painting. The painting hangs today in the Gemäldegalerie Alte Meister in Dresden, restored to the version its maker actually finished. The Cupid, once again visible on the wall, behind the woman, exactly where he placed it. Visitors standing in front of it now see something that nobody, for roughly 200 years, had any opportunity to see. A room with 2 paintings in it instead of 1. A private letter read beneath a small painted reminder about what love is supposed to demand. The woman herself has not changed. Her posture, her concentration, the particular quality of light Vermeer built the entire composition around, all of it survives exactly as he left it. What changed is the room she is standing in, and with it, a piece of the story art history had been confidently telling about the man who painted her. The next time this picture is used to explain what made Vermeer Vermeer, it will have to be explained honestly, as a painter working within his era's shared language of symbol and meaning rather than ahead of it, and as a canvas whose most famous feature, the very emptiness praised for 3 centuries as a mark of genius, turns out to have been somebody else's addition rather than his own. Standing in front of the restored version today, it is worth remembering how close that fact came to staying buried forever, sealed under a few square inches of gray paint and a scholarly consensus nobody thought to question. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.